1, 2, 3, 4.
Filled with awe and fright, see Jurassic Right, bathed in amber light. See Jurassic Right, see Jurassic Right, right. See Jurassic Right, right. See Jurassic Right, right. See Jurassic Right, see Jurassic Right, see Jurassic Park.
Yeah, this is See Jurassic Right. I'm Stephen Ray Morris. I'll waste no time because I'm talking with an incredible paleontologist, author, The Secret Lives of Dinosaurs. It features this, I got the book right here. It's a real chonky boy, fully illustrated, to quote Tim from Jurassic Park. It's very exciting to talk to Dr. Dean R. Lomax.
Hey, it's fantastic to chat to you as well, Stephen. No, thank you very much for such a lovely introduction. I've been a fan of yours for a while. I've listened to the podcast a bunch of times, and it's a great pleasure to be invited on to chat away with you.
Oh my gosh, I appreciate it so much. I mean, there's so many questions. But first, because we were about to talk about it offline, you did I was just catching up with your incredible Dinosaur Week in Queensland, Australia. What a cool event. How did all that come together? What was that like? I feel like that needs to happen everywhere.
Yeah, it really does. So that is Queensland Dinosaur Week, and about, let me work it out, probably August, September, I want to say. It might be a little bit later last year, so 2025, I had a message come through and from somebody at Queensland, basically Dinosaur Experiences Australia, who said, hey, we're planning to do the first ever Queensland Dinosaur Week that is kind of promoting and kind of screaming about how brilliant Queensland paleontology is on the world stage. And they wanted a paleontologist, an international paleontologist, to come over to Australia, to Queensland, to talk about kind of Queensland paleo on the world stage in terms of having that international perspective. And I was very humbled that they wanted me to come and do that, to talk about my own research, my own writing, kind of media, public outreach stuff, and how I perceive kind of Queensland paleontology and what we think of Queensland paleo from a UK perspective, international perspective, but also what I can kind of do in terms of collaborations with Queensland paleontologists, with students, with museums, with media, and getting people excited about paleontology. And I think one of the best things that came out of that is all this kind of collaboration, the community aspect. But one of the nicest things that the key person I worked with there, Karen Hannah Miller at Australian Dinosaur Experiences, that she kind of said is that sometimes in order for us to understand how truly unique and incredible our own kind of paleontology story is, you need somebody from outside to come here and tell you this is fantastic. And being there, it was actually my first time in Australia, and of course then first time in Queensland. I wanted to go to Queensland. I wanted to go, Stephen, for quite some time. And I remember reading about kind of new discoveries of things like Australovenator and some of the cool dinosaurs. Obviously, lots of amazing things like Muttaburrasaurus and that classic Australian dinosaur. I'd read about them kind of as a kid, as a teenager, and it was like, yeah, I got to go there one day. And so to be that person, to go out there to help kind of shine a light on some of these amazing museums and amazing people and fossils was quite humbling. So it was quite lovely to do that. Literally just last week, I got back five days ago. So wow. I'm not quite sure where my body clock is at the moment. And actually next week I'm off to Canada. So I'm a bit here, there, and everywhere. My head is a bit like, what are you doing? Fossils?
No, I mean it was really cool to see, and you'll talk about it a little bit later with your book, but just the idea of celebrating that specific place, and also just the idea of giving people opportunities to learn from experts. It's one of those things where I wish that kind of thing, and maybe that did happen when we were kids, but I feel like just giving those opportunities, especially to kids like that, is really cool.
Yeah, and that is one of the key things to come out of it. We had a whole load of events where you had hundreds of people turning up over. I'll probably get this wrong, and if Karen listens to this, she's probably going to say, oh, you got that wrong. But I'm pretty sure it was spread over the 1 week, there were 30 events and either 15 or 16 different venues that were involved in Queensland Dinosaur Week. And it was real, a fantastic testament to everybody who is involved, a lot of the amazing Queensland paleontologists. But as you say, quite rightly, having many families come to these events, and several of which had travelled over 10 plus hours, driven in the outback to come and meet me and take part in one of the events. And it's so humbling. But there's several people who shared such kind of personal stories about kind of how my story and my paleontological journey has kind of like touched them as families and really got them excited and inspired about paleontology. And so just that honestly was quite something. And being especially at some of the dig sites, and it literally is obviously the outback, you're so remote in many cases, being there was just quite exhilarating as well, because you have one of the sites at Kronosaurus Corner, you have multiple fossil sites that are literally 10 minutes from the museum, and you've got ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs. And it's almost just like it's the norm. And let me assure you, I was like, no, this is not normal. Not just where, maybe the odd piece of bone here and there, perhaps, but not pretty much complete skeletons and things that are being found. So it's that thing of coming from the UK and seeing this and telling kind of like the locals there in the community, like, oh no, this is pretty cool. And we ended up doing a whole lot of TV and media stuff too. So I did 2 or 3 live TV broadcasts, including on kind of the Australia's biggest kind of TV breakfast shows, which was good. One of which we did as a live direct from one of the digs, which was super cool. So obviously in that respect, we ended up touching kind of thousands of people and getting lots of people excited about Queensland paleo, which I just I love. I mean, that's one of the most fun aspects of my job as a paleontologist is the public outreach.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, you mentioned it, but like in my head, I think you assume every paleontologist was a dinosaur kid growing up. Were you? Do you remember like the first time you saw a dinosaur or ancient life?
Yeah, I was one of those dino nerds as a kid, and I laugh now because it's kind of like I never grew up. I just still have that that childlike fascination, and weirdly enough, there was never one specific thing that was it, and that was the turning point, and there's no going back. It was always a combination of things. So whether it was, of course, naturally Jurassic Park and those movies early on, I think it was a combination of that, like Land Before Time always hits nostalgia, a classic film, one of my favorites. But even things like documentaries, of course, watching Sir David Attenborough documentaries, and then reading books and visiting museums and collecting fossils. There was never one thing that really was like that turning point. But I remember going to museums and seeing skeletons of ichthyosaurs, of dinosaurs, be that replica or real specimens, and just being awestruck by these truly extraordinary creatures that just allowed you for that moment, especially I remember as a kid, where you're coming face to face with something like that, and especially if you read a label or you had somebody tell you that's 150 million years old, and you just think they're like, wow, and you're connected through the depths of time to these creatures that you're staring at them in a display, and it's still that's still that fascination that I have today, as you can probably gather from my fascination for it and my passion for it, Stephen.
Oh, totally. No, and again, your journey, for people who aren't familiar, is really inspiring. I think very, you what's the right word for it? I mean, you sold off your Star Wars toy collection as part of your journey to becoming a paleontologist. So you have to tell people the path
I'll tell you
became.
that. Yeah, my origin story to becoming Dr. Dean Lomax. So yeah, my origin story to that is kind of very unconventional, as you say, and so definitely one of those kids, loved dinosaurs and that, and as I got a little bit older as a teenager, I continued to just work hard in school. I despite that, didn't do very well academically. I just wasn't very good as an academic, and so I was more a kind of like average CD student, not the best. And as a result, I ended up failing science in high school, which it's crazy to think about now because I have a PhD in paleontology, in science. So it's so bizarre to even say that and think like that. But I just wasn't very good academically. And so at the end of high school, I didn't have the grades. I also didn't have the finances to go to university. And so I had to look at how am I going to actually go into paleontology professionally and without having a degree. And so, you quite rightly quite rightly said that I ended up selling my Star Wars collection of action figures, amongst things like Transformers toys as well. I had them too, and even some, but not all. I managed to cling on to some of my Jurassic Park toys and that. But yeah, even some of them made the cut too, and had to be sold when I was kind of 17, 18, and that was it was quite the sacrifice, that and also working 2 or 3 jobs I really didn't like, and my mom, bless her, and family, we come from quite a poor background, and so I was brought up in an area called Doncaster in South Yorkshire in the UK, which is kind of, just geographically for listeners, is kind of about 3 hours north of London, and its closest big city is like Leeds, and like close to like the Yorkshire coast, kind of, so the east coast, and so we grew up, didn't have much money. Kind of, my mom had kind of struggled to pay the mortgage, that sort of family. But even her, bless her, she'd be working extra hours to raise a bit of money for me to kind of keep my dream alive. And so the point of that is I sold that collection and worked jobs and things to go on this volunteer trip to Wyoming when I was 18 in 2008, which is 18 years ago. And let me tell you, that still feels like yesterday, getting on that plane and being away from family properly for the first time. Wow. and going to America for the first time. It was a huge undertaking. And now when I think about it, it was a very much a pivotal moment in my career to come. But also, it was an enormous decision too, and I can think about it from my mum's perspective and family's perspective of like, that must have been so hard, because it wasn't like today where you have your phone and you're connected constantly. When I got out to Wyoming, my phone didn't work. The only connection I had back home was this really old school, I guess, like Windows 95 computer that I could just about email people back home, and I was like, yes, I'm alive, dinosaurs are still cool, that sort of thing. But that was the career defining trip for me, getting my foot on the ladder and going to volunteer at the museum in Wyoming.
I mean, that is just such a reoccurring theme. When I've talked to other paleontologists or science communication, is really just like the power of volunteering. Like, it feels like, especially in the US right now, when science is very much being defunded, it just seems like, there's an empowering sense that, if you do want to pursue this, you can, because, a lot of it is, I think talking to like Callie Moore a few years ago of like, oh yeah, there's just like tons of stuff that needs to be cataloged that people haven't looked at in decades. People need help like in the museums, like all of it just seems so, you can, there's a window there for you to try and put your foot in the door, kind of thing.
That's right. You basically, you can do it. That's the thing. And it might be difficult for listeners to think, well, hey, how am I just going to become a paleontologist? And that was kind of my journey, is that by getting my foot on the ladder and then kind of working my way up. So that initial trip allowed me to be around academics for the first time, to understand the process of academia. Before that, I didn't even know what an academic paper was. I had no clue what an academic paper was. And I always laugh about it now, but some of the students back then, master's students, I think maybe a couple of undergrads, they kept saying, have you read this paper? Have you read this paper? And I naively thought they meant newspapers, and I legitimately thought that, and they did have a good laugh at that. But I had no clue. But it was the first time, being around academics, being at a world-class museum, getting my kind of real experience in terms of field work, understanding preparation, molding, the whole thing, and it got my foot on the ladder, and then it kind of got me thinking, right, well, as you said there, with a good mutual friend, Callie Moore, there's a lot of opportunity there to volunteer in museums, depending on where you are, globally around the world. But there are opportunities. there are always opportunities to just, especially nowadays, to have access to academic papers, to read them, to go to conferences, to join things online, to listen to podcasts. All this sort of stuff is there, and it's far more available now than it was when I was starting out. So in many ways, people were listening to this who are just kind of getting into paleontology. You're already ahead of the game than I were back when I was 18. But all of that stuff is what really got me massively excited. And I came back from that trip and was kind of had this newfound knowledge and experience and began then really randomly now thinking about it, I began writing my first academic paper, and I had no clue what I was doing. Obviously, I hadn't a clue what academia was, but it was through the encouragement of people I'd met, professors who were visiting the museum and other students who had just encouraged me to start doing that. And serendipitously, I ended up coming across this ichthyosaur, which is in my local museum when I was in Doncaster at Doncaster Museum. And that was such a spectacular find that at the time, the museum thought it was a plaster copy. They thought it was a replica, which is, to be fair to them, they had it mixed up with a plesiosaur replica, and they didn't have a paleontologist, I'll point out. They had an archaeologist and that was it. They didn't have a paleontologist. The last paleontologist, he died 100 years ago. So, so to be fair to them, they didn't have that. And so had this, this now 18-year-old kid volunteering after the back of this trip to Wyoming. And I was like, oh no, that's a real specimen. And that specimen was, again, serendipitous for me to kind of rediscover that, but that was a real turning point. That's where my first academic paper, I began writing pretty much immediately off the back of that trip, and as an 18-year-old, and that I would go on to publish when I was 20. And so I ended up becoming a published scientist at 20. And in those 2 years, I was still gaining experience. I actually ended up going back to Wyoming to volunteer again for another 4 months. I volunteered at other places in France. I continued to volunteer at Doncaster Museum, and all the while just kind of building on this network of contacts that I'd had and the community of paleo people. And so, yeah, after those 2 years up until the publication, and for a couple more years probably after, I was still pretty much working jobs I didn't like and was pumping all the money that I could earn. I'd do a few talks here and a few bits and pieces in paleo to earn a little bit more money, but everything that I was earning was just going back into gaining experience, whether that was helping me kind of gain more volunteer experience at Doncaster Museum or going to attend a conference or joining up to an organization. It was kind of, and my approach has always been to paleo is kind of, it's an all or nothing kind of field for me, is that it's not generally speaking, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's a commitment, and for me, it's my passion. So I absolutely love it. I live and breathe paleo, and eventually all the hard work started to pay off. And easily though, I'd say, Stephen, I've been working now. This summer marks 18 years since that original trip. So professionally, 18 years since kind of going out there, and for that first 5 years was a real struggle, but eventually paid off the persistence. But anybody listening to this, there are opportunities there, and I always say it's key. It's passion, perseverance, and persistence. Those three things can really take you far.
Yeah, no, I love it. And you brought it up, your baby, the ichthyosaur. What do you love about ichthyosaurs? What's special about them?
Yeah, they're such a fascinating group to study, and as I say, I serendipitously fell into studying these little beasties. That for listeners, ichthyosaurs, I say little beasties, some of them are bloody gigantic, but ichthyosaurs, the stereotypical ichthyosaur looks a bit like a dolphin or a shark. They are ancient marine reptiles. They swam in the seas. They're not swimming dinosaurs, although they were swimming around in the seas at the same time dinosaurs walking on land. But they're a truly fascinating group of animals that kind of appeared, that we think, right, as far as we know right now, about 250 million years ago. In the first kind of ichthyosaurs looked a bit like, I guess, a little bit more like eel-like lizards with flippers. Okay. And then like kind of fins, and then they gradually over several million years evolved into enormous size, and then eventually got absolutely enormous blue whale size things. And I was as a kid, I was drawn to them through Mary Anning, who's actually, it's her birthday today as we're recording this. It's actually Mary Anning's birthday. Would you believe?
Happy
Talking
birthday.
to me, chatting Ichthyosaurs. Happy birthday to Mary Anning.
Oh my God.
And it was, growing up and reading about Mary Anning, and she was my childhood hero. That was my first kind of gateway into Ichthyosaurs. And then, that discovery in my hometown museum, Doncaster, and meeting renowned paleontologists who work on marine reptiles, work on ichthyosaurs in Wyoming, kind of everything kind of fell into place. And then now, as an academic, I've spent that 18 years. Although I work on a variety of things, so I've named a new dinosaur, for example. I've described other dinosaurs. I've written papers on things like sea scorpions, eurypterids, to even things like ammonites and plants. But my main love, one true love, is ichthyosaurs, and I guess that's where I've become really well known in academia and beyond as kind of the ichthyosaur guy. And I must have written probably now over 100 papers, probably about 70 or so on ichthyosaurs, and that's describing new species. It could be describing some giants that could be blue whale size, to things like ichthyosaurs that were pregnant, one of which was pregnant probably with octuplets. So
Wow.
there's such a lot of cool research that I've been very privileged to work on and really get to know ichthyosaurs over the years, and also walk in the footsteps of Mary Anning and literally
it's so lovely.
literally examine practically every single ichthyosaur that Mary Anning found that we know of. I've examined
That's
and
so cool.
been through her original. It's so humbling, Stephen, for being the guy who has had that opportunity and worked really hard to get to that point of reliving, kind of trying to get in the headspace of Mary Anning and going through specimens we know she found, specimens we know she even illustrated and wrote about, and you can get a headspace when she was collecting some of this stuff. So to have had that, and then even the one I mentioned at Doncaster Museum, that turned out to be a new species that I identified and described in 2015. So what's that, 11 years ago, with a good friend and colleague, Professor Judy Messere. And she and I named that in honor of Mary Anning. We called it Ichthyosaurus anningae, and that's still to this day the only ichthyosaur named in honor of Mary Anning.
I was going to ask, it must be so cool to name and describe a species. Like, is that daunting? Like, where do you you're like, oh, this is okay, I get to do this. What is that process like?
It is. It can be daunting, because when you're writing an academic paper, you've got to put it through peer review. And so if you spent, let's say, it could be in some cases years examining specimens and comparing one ichthyosaur to probably 100 others or more, and then going through the literature to a point where you think, actually, this is probably something new to science, a new species or a new genus. What are your peers going to think of this? Are you going to be correct? Is your science correct? Is it going to hold up, kind of thing? And so that's quite daunting. But one of the kind of coolest things is that, and I remember a moment that I had with I mentioned the Professor Judy Messere. We were actually in the basement of the Natural History Museum, and as a paleontologist, that's often where you go. It's funny, people are like, "Oh, you get to travel everywhere," and it's like, yeah, usually it's just the basement of a museum, and that's it. But there's often lots of cool paleo goodies in there. And I remember when we were constructing the final pieces of the puzzle to that original description, which the original paper we must have drafted, I think 2013. Perhaps 2013, 14, around that time, we were in the basement of the Natural History Museum in London, and we were looking over various ichthyosaurs, including several Mary Annings. And one of them, which was found by Mary Anning, we identified as an Ichthyosaurus anningae. And we just had a very surreal moment that Mary Anning, in her life, had found what one day would become a species named after her of Ichthyosaurus anningae. And it's so cool that at that moment in the world, only Professor Messere, Judy, and I knew that. And it was such a, I can feel it actually now, like goosebumps kind of moment. And that's one of the coolest things, where you get to name a new species. And then when you're adding that to that kind of bigger picture of ancient life, and you're adding to the story of paleontology, that in another 200 years down the line, hopefully people are going to look back at my work and be like, yeah, that Dr. Lomax was an all right. You got it right,
Oh, that's so cool. The Secret Lives of Dinosaurs. Paleoethology Is that the term dinosaur behavior? When did you realize you wanted to write this book? I'm holding it up for listeners. For listeners, if people are listening for video, you could see it. But anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, it's paleoethology is the term, and that's the ethology is the study of behaviors in modern animals, but also you can apply that to paleo as well. And it's funny, I imagine a lot of people would imagine the thing of well, how do you understand behavior from fossils, right? Which ultimately are rock. Is it not all just kind of like random conjecture, or is it based on, I don't know, biomechanics of how these animals moved and bite forces and stuff? But and of course, I should say, obviously, it's not just tracks and traces and burrows, which, of course, are evidence of behavior. But in terms of the Secret Lives of Dinosaurs, kind of the idea behind that actually goes way back to that original trip to Wyoming. And on my first day volunteering in the museum, I was given a tour around the museum, and I was shown this really cool block of limestone, which it really didn't look like much, but the volunteer who was giving me this tour, his name was Jordi, who was from Spain, Jordi San Juan Rubio. Jordi said to me, "Hey, Dean, have a look at this." And he said, "What do you think?" And there's like all these like weird trampling things there. And I said, "Well, it looks like it might be a track of some description." He's like, "Well, follow it." So I followed it. And dead in its tracks was a horseshoe crab from the very famous Solnhofen limestone of Archaeopteryx kind of territory, that area. And it blew my mind. And here was a 150 million-year-old horseshoe crab that had been flung into this ancient Jurassic lagoon, fell on its back, wriggled around, righted itself, walked for 9.7 meters, 33 feet, and then was literally dead in its tracks. Now, it's terrible for the horseshoe crab. It didn't end very well, right? It's, that's sad. Fossils, everybody dies in the end, right?
Yeah.
But for somebody like myself back then as an 18-year-old, it blew my mind. It really changed the way I thought about fossils and behavior in fossils. And that originally gave me this idea, almost to a point, no exaggeration, there and then thinking, well, what other fossils are like that? Maybe there could be a book one day, Dean. And originally, that led to this book called Locked in Time, which maybe you've heard of, Stephen. And that when I did Locked in Time with Bob Nichols, who I know we'll talk about in a moment, who is a wonderfully talented paleo artist and great friend, he brought that idea to life. And I always kind of thought when I wrote Locked in Time, and actually with Bob thought the same, is that maybe we could do something bigger. And we could do something on a more kind of bigger scale, like with the same theme of behavior. And this is where the Secret Lives of Dinosaurs came from. And the focus is very much the title, unearthing the real behaviors of prehistoric animals. And it's not just dinosaurs; it is looking at prehistoric animals more broadly. But it's kind of getting into the kind of the entire history of life of if you imagine modern animals as well. So you've got starting out, and you've got death and everything that happens in between. That's what we see in modern animals today. That's what we see in humans. That's what we might watch in a Sir David Attenborough documentary, where you've got African savanna and you see a pride of lions, and they're growing up and they've got cubs and they're having to go and hunt and they're playing, all that sort of stuff. And so my idea was to look at the fossil record firsthand, physically go and see a lot of specimens, but also go through the extensive literature of 200 plus years and come up with distinct chapters that tell the story and the history of life. And it's kind of this, the grand cycle of life in deep time. And so that goes from starting out to then to eggs and babies, to families and friends, to moving along, to finding food, to conflict, all told by exceptionally preserved fossils that have the direct evidence, whether that is evidence of last meals preserved, whether that's evidence of disease or broken bones. Each of these fossils help to tell that story of the grand cycle of life. And nobody had, apart from Locked in Time to a point, nobody had ever actually done that in a popular science writing style. And that's why kind of when me and Bob were coming up with this concept, we said it's quite novel for paleo and science writing. And so it was a huge undertaking. It took just over 3 years, about 3.5 years to write and illustrate. But we think we've created something great. And hopefully people have enjoyed it. So far, all the comments have been very positive. So I'm hoping that you've also enjoyed reading it, Stephen.
Well, and I feel like it's one of those things where, especially, people who are like as an enthusiast, but then, more people who like dinosaurs or maybe are just watching, Prehistoric Planet or, other dinosaur docs, and like, how do they know this? And I feel like you could point to your book and you're like, oh, well, here's like trace fossils of like a dinosaur swimming through the, like, this is the science to me. Like when you read this book, you're like, oh, if you ever, when you see a herd of, Triceratops or something, it's like, well, okay, because they found these types of like, it feels like there's an example for everything you could see in a dinosaur doc. You're like, oh no, this, like, you found examples of pretty much everything. It feels like.
That's exactly it. And in fact, how you phrase that there about kind of Prehistoric Planet and Jurassic Park and things that we see in there, often there are things that, of course, based on fossil evidence, of course, but not necessarily the direct evidence of behaviors. And that's one of the things which we really wanted to hone in on and do something very original, do something novel. And I like the comment you mentioned there, like Prehistoric Planet, and because recently there was a Netflix series, The Dinosaurs, which I actually loosely worked on as part of my media work, very, very briefly, one of the consultants on it. But I saw when some parts of it went viral on social media, and I saw some of the big things that people were sharing were like, oh, how do they know this? And how do they have this? And often those comments or posted end up getting thousands of likes or comments on there. And it's like, yeah, it's all made up, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, actually, wave my finger like, well, actually, no, that's not quite the case. And you do have behavior preserved in the fossil record, and you have some spectacular evidence for it. And of course, there is, with some of these fossils, of course, some more interpretations, but the way in which you can kind of interpret them is by looking at, not always, but by looking at some modern animals, modern behaviors, modern ethology. And that's by, again, either looking at the literature or getting out and seeing some of these animals behaving either in the wild, or even if you go to a zoo or wildlife sanctuary or something too, which from Bob's perspective, many of the reconstructions, which are in colour in Secret Lives of Dinosaurs, from his perspective, for the idea, he and I would sit down, go through all of this sort of stuff in terms of what we want to show and what behavior you want to try and capture. But he would physically go out and look at modern animals as good analogs to look at behaviors that we may be able to see that could be quite similar. And then also look at kind of color reconstructions and how they interact with one another. It's that level of detail that goes into his reconstructions.
No, it feels like in the great lineage of like Charles R. Knight, like you're bringing to life these, he was bringing to life these moments that feel very like iconic.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's such a good friend. I've known him for a long time now, and we're on a bit of a book tour at the moment for kind of started, I guess, when the book came out last year in September, October. We started doing a couple of talks, and we've done a few things here in the UK. There's a few more planned for the States as well, and probably a couple of bits in Europe. But each time the two of us are together, it's a good dynamic. And often when I'll introduce him, I'll have a little bit of fun with him, and I'll just have a bit of paper, reading away, and I'm like, Bob Nichols is a spectacular artist. He's wonderful, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, Bob, I can't read your handwriting, So it's that kind of silly dynamic that we have between the two of us. And I like to think as well, some of that humor is expressed in my writing, but also in some of his artwork too, but also obviously always being mindful of the science. But yeah, very much so. This book is not, of course, an academic textbook. It is aimed at that kind of broad reader, broad interest, people who love Jurassic Park, Jurassic World, and Prehistoric Planet, the dinosaurs, that sort of thing. And that's pretty much the way in which I wrote the book, and that's where it's kind of pitched at.
I mean, yeah, it really feels there's an element to it that feels like a conversation with a friend. It's just like, oh my God, isn't this really exciting? Here's, examples, here's the process that I went through to learn about this. And that was another theme I thought about when reading the book, is that you can learn a lot about behavior through evolution. Like, can you speak, like, it's just those interesting examples of like, does that make sense? Like, we can learn about behavior through evolution.
Yeah, absolutely that. And that's one of the key things where we were looking at trying to connect the dots between, if we had something very unusual in the fossil record. For example, one of the things we had was a a very unusual early arthropod, early invert that had these weird little babies attached to it. And we call it's nicknamed like the kite runner. And this is such a strange little critter that there seemingly isn't any behaviors that we find in modern animals, and we haven't got a really good analog. But what you can do is try and find similar evidence in the case of other arthropods. Do they have something similar, similar sort of behaviors preserved, or do they have, and this was also, I should point out, this is about like parental care in this really weird ancient arthropod. What level of parental care do things like, say, lobsters and crabs and that have in their individuals? Are there ways in which some species of modern day inverts or arthropods, they have a level of parental care that you could link back to this? And so through evolution, even if it wasn't a case of linking, let's say, an animal that has no direct kind of descendants, there might be, looking along the evolutionary chain and looking along the family tree, there may be something that actually has a similar behavior that you can kind of take parts from. And it's not, and one thing we were very mindful of, we don't want to say, hey, this animal looks like it might do something similar, so therefore it must have behaved in the same way. Not at all. Sure. But you can use the kind of the family tree of life, and you can look into certain species that may be very, very distantly related, but perhaps they were doing something similar today, or they're doing something similar today, which said creature might have been doing way back 500 million years ago. And that sort of thing, through evolution, you can really make those connections and help to connect the dots between certain species and behaviors.
It's so fascinating. And that's the other thing that I really liked about the book, is because I feel like in the past growing up, maybe dinosaurs were sort of, wow, this is, non-avian dinosaurs, or whatever you like. They're presented almost in this, when we think about Land Before Time or like ancient life, or like dinosaurs are this very separate thing. But I feel like your book, it's like, no, here's the mammals, here's the other reptiles, here's, birds and stuff. Like, do you think, as far as creating a picture for modern audiences, do you think this goes a long way in like making dinosaurs more like grounded? I don't know if that's the right word. It feels less of like a myth or a fantasy. Like, dinosaurs are very real. And I feel like nowadays dinosaur media, and this book included, go a long way to be like, no, here's what life was like then. And it very much can seem similar to life today in many ways.
Absolutely that. And I think that's one of the key points of this book in particular, is that it's trying to showcase these animals as living, breathing creatures, more than just kind of what we might see in a museum display, where you may have a skeleton or you may have a fossil shell, which is fabulous, and they can be inspiring in their own right. But once you have that kind of telltale evidence of behaviors, you can start to see these things in a different way. And I know I talk about this in the introduction, I think, about you end up, and maybe you'll agree, Stephen, that you end up having a bit of empathy for some of these animals who had gone through quite, in some cases, horrific behaviors. But this is the thing where I wanted to kind of tug at heartstrings a little bit. But as I say, I include a little bit of humor here and there in the Secret Lives of Dinosaurs, because these animals were as real as you and me, and as real as the squirrels on the trees, the birds flying above. They were real animals, and it's so easy sometimes to say, watch Jurassic Park or Jurassic World, or watch documentaries, Prehistoric Planet, the dinosaurs, whatever it might be, and to kind of have this mindset where you separate yourself kind of from today and go back in time, which is understandable because you're talking millions of years. But we shouldn't separate prehistoric animals from modern animals and modern behaviors, because they all did the same sorts of things. Yeah. They all had to, start out. They had to go through all the trials and tribulations of life. Some of them will have died of starvation, for example, as we see in modern animal communities today. We'll have had others that would have literally fought to the death, as we know there are extraordinary evidence of fossils showing that, and others that would have mated and passed on their genes and all that sort of stuff. And it's one of the key things that we really wanted to hone in on and just help people to see them, as living, breathing creatures. And I think, it as you say, it helps. I think you're right. It's like grounded, is that kind of grounded understanding that you can go to a museum and see a cool dinosaur skeleton or whatever it might be, and that is amazing. But then when you start to have those little bits of evidence to to showcase these animals with a bit more character, you can connect with them in a very different way. And I think that's what we did. Hopefully did quite well with Secret Lives.
Since obviously you've written many books, has that affected, I'm always curious, does that, and also, with social media, does that kind of stuff affect your, the actual science side of things? Has that changed the way you approach, when you approach a fossil or you go to a museum? Has that impacted it in any way or changed your outlook on it?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I've never been asked that before. I guess it does to a point. So, when you're kind of writing for a kind of more general, broad audience, obviously it's very different to kind of academic audience where you might be writing for 5 people in the world this very technical term for this tiny bit of bone and this little facet and all this sort of stuff is very different. But it has changed the way in which I do approach some academic studies. So it's not a case of, and of course this is also, I guess, how paleontology and how the science is changing too. But I wouldn't necessarily say go and look at an ichthyosaur skeleton. Like literally last week when I was in Queensland in the outback, looking at new material that has been found in most cases found by farmers who have discovered an ichthyosaur. I don't necessarily look at that as just as an academic saying, hey, okay, I could describe that. I could work with some local paleontologists from Queensland with students. We can describe whether it's an existing, it belongs to an existing species, or it could be something new. It might be the most complete specimen. I'm not just thinking like that from an academic standpoint. It helps me, I think, writing more broadly helps me to kind of communicate better in terms of it's not just the academic context. You actually can think, well, what's the story here? Yeah. What's the human element as well? Is it the farmer finding this ichthyosaur, contacting the museum, getting that specimen in a museum, making sure it's secured for science? Those sorts of things. When you start to unpack that, you start to see that the academic side of things, the research is, of course, vital to understanding paleontology. That's what we've done for 200 years. You've written these things up, you get them published. That's brilliant. But you also see that that's part of the process. And as somebody who has become kind of, I guess, a spokesperson in paleo for outreach, especially in public engagement, I think it's so vitally important now that we don't just approach kind of a fossil or a study of kind of that's it. You've got to think of what's the next step in terms of getting that message out there. And so I try to take that and put some of that into my writing. And there are several in the book, in the chapters, where I tell a bit more of my kind of story with that fossil, and not just from, hey, I described this in a journal. It's more like, hey, I remember when I met this person and we looked at this fossil and we were like, oh, this is super cool. What can we learn from this? And then it's like, hey, yeah, you can do the academic work, but from the story viewpoint, what is that story? And then it's telling that story. And yeah, I like the fact that I'm able to kind of blend between those two worlds. So go into academia and then into the kind of the popular science writing, and take bits of one and another and try and cross them over. Sometimes it's difficult. I'll work with colleagues. I'll work with colleagues like I mentioned, Professor Judy Messere, and I'll write a draft of a paper or a section in a paper, and it'll come back with plenty. And even to this day, it'll come back with plenty of red scribbles on there and crossed out. And she's like, "Dean, you're not writing for the popular science audience here. We've got to turn this back round to academia." And it's like, "Oh yeah, that's true. and it's so easy to do, but it's because, again, I love kind of blending one with the other, and I think it's important. Yeah, as I say, kind of the storytelling aspect of it.
No, that makes total sense. Do you, when you're going out and talking to people, and again, out in Queensland only a week ago, what are some of the big questions that you get asked a lot by people, adults or kids?
Oh, big questions. I get so many questions, and it varies kind of tremendously, and probably some of the stuff that kind of, it sounds probably quite basic, but it really isn't. So one or two of the times over the last few years, and in fact, at one of the talks in Queensland, I had I can't remember which dinosaur it was now, but there was a young lad who'd asked a question just the other week, saying something along the lines of he'd seen a new dinosaur discovery, and for the life of me, I can't remember now. And he said, "Oh, have you heard of this dinosaur discovery? What do I think of it?" And it seems so basic and such an innocent question, but in actuality, I had no idea which dinosaur he was talking about. And that is a good thing in the sense of, as a paleontologist, you're kind of expected to know everything, right? In the entire history of life. And I said to him, I was like, "Oh, what is that dinosaur? Can you tell me about it?" Ooh. And so that was quite a powerful thing for him. And he's like, "Oh yeah, absolutely. This is this dinosaur." And again, I feel bad because I don't know what it was, but he was saying, "Oh, it was found here. It was here." And I was like, "Right, cool. I need to read up about this." And I like that because it's such a powerful thing where, for that kid who was probably about 7 or 8 years old, he, for that kind of time, was like, "Yeah, I know something that Dr. Dean Lomax doesn't know about dinosaurs." And it just goes to show that with science, you're constantly learning. Yeah. And so although that's not like a big question, for me, it's kind of, that is a big moment for for that child. That's another thing where, as I say, like, I was one of those kids loving dinosaurs, and no doubt, Stephen, you must have been Jurassic Park fan, no doubt, of course. So it's that sort of thing where who knows where that little conversation might go down the line, and not necessarily sparking him to become a paleontologist, but just he may remember that. And I think there's something quite powerful about that. But in terms of kind of like big questions, they often get asked of kind of where, so it's an obvious kind of question about, like, asteroids and things, and why dinosaurs like T-Rex and Triceratops and co all disappeared. That sort of thing is always kind of coming up, and we have plenty of evidence now for that, why dinosaurs demised after the asteroid impact, why that created obviously waves of devastation, and why only birds are the only living, breathing dinosaurs. But I often get asked that sort of question, and again, it's quite an easy-ish one to answer, because there's been so much more research and that kind of presented over the last, several decades now. But even still, that's still a big question to be asking, and usually again by children. But another one that I'll get asked is, how do we really know how dinosaurs sounded or how what colors they would have been? And so you can kind of tap into, for several dinosaurs, and not just dinosaurs, other prehistoric animals, we do have direct evidence of color now. We have feathers or skin that's been found with tiny pigments called melanosomes, that we can work out exactly what colors some dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals were, which, even you go back 20, 30 years, and if you said to somebody, "Hey, in 30 years' time, we're going to know that a Sinosauropteryx was a kind of gingery color, and it was had a stripy tail," paleontologists then had laughed and said, "Oh, what are you talking about? We're never going to know that." But no, we can. We do know that. But that is a thing, as I say, the other point of kind of being quizzed on how dinosaurs sound. Like, that's a really tough one. And I remember that was a question that was brought up in Queensland, and that kind of stumps you a little bit, because there's only so much that we can talk about, because there's only so much that we know. And of course, you have to go into kind of modern dinosaurs, so birds, and talk about the sounds they make. But then you can't really imagine, say, a T-Rex making chirps and things like that. But probably it did. I'm sure it did as a chick, but as an adult, definitely not. And that's where it probably did much more like bellows and grumbles, like crocodiles and alligators, which are, of course, the next closest relatives to birds. They're archosaurs. So yeah, those types of things are difficult to answer. And again, similarly, another one, I mean, as you can imagine, I get lots, but there's another one is a hard one to kind of answer, is about kind of ichthyosaur evolution and getting to like gigantic size. And one of the ichthyosaurs that I named Ichthyotitan in 2024 is based on 2 ginormous jawbones that are incomplete, I should say, as well. And these individuals, these 2 giant jawbones, indicate an animal that you're talking of easily over 20 meters, probably 25, 26 meter animals. And we have evidence of other individuals that are probably far bigger. And you're then talking 30 plus meter animals, which are contenders for largest or longest animals ever, at least in the oceans as well. And, truly enormous things. And some of the questions about that is, well, how did they evolve in the first place? Why did it get so big? and there's a lot of kind of question marks around that. But also, if you had an animal like an ichthyosaur at, let's say, 30 meters, what in the world is that eating?
Yeah.
Is it more, is it kind of, is it doing something like we see the giant whales of today, blue whales, filter feeding? In my opinion, absolutely not. I think they had giant teeth, and I think they're top of the food chain, apex predators, but they must have been eating a lot of other animals. And what was that? What was their prey? What was their food sources? So yeah, all these sorts of things, Stephen. And it's so good that you get these kinds of questions from a wide mix of people too. So it's not just children. It is kind of interested adults as well, who love to come to events, and yeah, there may be, I'd probably say over the last 5 years, I've done a whole load of different talks and events where you may have an audience of a couple of hundred up to, I think the biggest audience I had was about 3,000 people. And that was at the TED talk that I gave a few years ago. And it had so many people. Yeah. So many people come to that. And, I love it. I love the outreach side of things. As you can probably gather, it really radiates from me, because I just think it can evoke so many questions from people who may not have any interest, and that's one of the things you do find as well, is that you end up getting families who come in particular who are, hey, I'm here, I'm supporting my daughter, my son, and then by the end of it, the son and daughter are taking a back seat, and the mum and dad are like, hey, so what about this? What about that? And it's because you've engaged, you've done your job, you've got people excited by it, and yeah, you just know full well that they're going home then in the car journey home, and so they're like, yeah, so you were right, son, daughter, dinosaurs are cool, and then they get into it. Yeah,
that's lovely. How do you stay curious today, even now?
Yeah. So I try my best to kind of get outside and explore. Obviously, as a paleontologist, one of the coolest things, of course, is always getting out and looking for fossils. And my time in Queensland, I think the phrase of the week there was, we need more time, because there's so much cool stuff and so many amazing places, especially in the outback, to go and explore more. But as a paleontologist, getting the chance to do that physically, get out to sites, see material, keeps me very curious. I'm always trying to keep up to date as best I can with kind of latest cool finds in paleo, whether that is just looking at ichthyosaurs, dinosaurs, but it's I have a very, very broad interest in paleo, so I try and keep up to date with the latest finds, whatever gets picked up in the news or some peer review kind of stuff. But yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts as well. I read books when I get a chance, or at least listen to audio books and things, and try and keep up to date with documentaries, and not always just paleo stuff. It might be more broadly kind of nature docs or whatever. Sure. and yeah, stay very curious in that respect. And yeah, I think it's one of the key things in, not to get philosophical about it, but I think in life, it's important to just continue to learn as much as you can. And one of the things, going back to that trip in Wyoming, one of the key things for me was being able to travel. That really just broadened my horizons and allowed me to really think that there's more out there than just kind of my hometown of Doncaster. As much as I love Doncaster, but it was my, getting away from Doncaster and exploring the world, and then having the chance to go to a glacier in Chilean Patagonia and unearth a pregnant ichthyosaur, to then go to a farmer's field in the outback in Queensland and then see a dinosaur that's been found, or see an ichthyosaur that's been found there. And then it might be just an event in the UK, it might be giving a talk, and you have a child or a family who come up and show you that they found some fossils. It's all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I love it, live and breathe it.
Your enthusiasm is infectious. Thank you so much, Dean. One last question. It's a very silly one. There's going to be another Jurassic Park movie, of course. It's a constant now, and it's great. Right. If you had to pick some new dinosaurs, marine reptiles, ancient life, what would you cast in the next one?
Oh, let's see. I would love to, for obvious reasons, love to see an ichthyosaur in that.
We got
obviously. Got to say that. And I'd really like to see, I said about that Ichthyotitan, as it stands at the minute, Ichthyotitan's the largest marine reptile ever to have lived that we know of. So yeah, it'd be pretty cool to see Ichthyotitan in there. But I think maybe something maybe in something down the lines of kind of mammalian or something like that, like it'd be interesting to have like saber-toothed cats or whatever. That'd be quite cool to see. I know it's obviously not the dinosaur era, but even something like that would be quite neat to see. On your side, do you have anything like that you'd like to see, Stephen?
I mean, I would love to see my favorite dinosaur, Shunosaurus, because it's just such a unique sauropod with, you know, a club tail and a little bit more armor on its skin. And it's not, you know, one of the Titan sauropods. It's a little bit smaller. And so seeing that represented in live action would be super cool. And I think, and one of my other favorite dinosaurs, Shantungosaurus, which is like the biggest duckbill dinosaur, it's only been seen dead on the beach as a carcass in the Meg 2. And it's unlike justice for Shantungosaurus, because it's, you know, thinking of for listeners, like thinking of a Parasaurolophus, but then you're like, oh, it's actually like so much bigger.
That thing is an absolute unit, isn't it? Like it's enormous, bigger than T-Rex. It's a massive animal. So yeah, I'd love to see something like that. And actually just sticking with the theme of like the new movies and stuff, because I always kind of get asked as my kind of opinion on Jurassic Park, Jurassic World as a professional paleontologist. And I'm a huge fan. I'm a big fan of the series and the franchise. I think what it's done for paleo is quite tremendous. Early on, the first movie and the first couple of movies helped to get so many more people into museums. It managed to get people into paleontology. There was a bunch of funding that got given as a result of those films to various universities and things. And so there's been all of that sparked that interest. And even like the latest movie, Jurassic World Rebirth, I thought was, I saw a lot of stuff online about kind of some criticisms for it and things here and there. But at large, it's good that these movies are being made, because it still gets people coming into, to museums and being curious and wanting to learn more about kind of real paleontology. And on that point, I know as a big fan of the franchise, Stephen, I don't know if you're aware of this, but last year when that film came out, I was actually I was invited to go to the premiere in London, which was pretty cool. And I had a chance to chat to a couple of the people who were behind the scenes, see some of the main celebs, and see Scarlett Johansson wave at her, got a wave from her and stuff. So which was pretty cool. And so it was nice to go to that, and especially to chat with people who had worked on the original Jurassic Park with Spielberg for, have a good 5 minutes chat conversation and say to them, as a paleontologist growing up, being influenced by these movies, thank you for making them. And I had a really heartfelt conversation with one or two people who worked, as I say, on the original couple of movies, Jurassic Park and Lost World. And so that was quite cool, as the dino fanboy in me there as a Jurassic Park fan. So having a chance to do that was neat. And before we leave as well, just to ask you, Stephen, because I didn't get a chance to, but what was your favorite, not to put you on the spot, but what was your favorite chapter or favorite section in The Secret Lives of Dinosaurs?
Oh my God, the chapter that talks about the birds, or the opening chapter, like you have these little fun descriptions, and it's about how like crows have taken spikes off of things, and you go smart dinosaurs. Just the, especially like the stuff that is like bringing these ancient creatures to life. Like that was the cool part of like evidence for like, oh, the again, the swimming or that lizard, that ancient lizard protecting its young when they sadly drowned, like in the tree. Like to me, that stuff just really like paints a full picture of life on this planet, hundreds of millions of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate it. No, it sounds like you really connected with the idea behind The Secret Lives of Dinosaurs too, and it is that thing, as I say, evoking kind of empathy or a bit of humor and stuff, which I think really helps to bring these animals to life. And like for example, you mentioned there about the one in the tree and stuff. Like it's such a kind of horrible moment for these animals, but it allows you to realize that was a moment in time that happened. That was a thing, and that was a behavior that is captured there. So. Yeah, fantastic. Well, no, I've had fantastic time chatting to you, Stephen. And do you have any other questions for me whilst we're chatting on Mary Anning's birthday?
No, we need to catch up more again soon. I feel like I have a million other questions, and I need to read some of your other books, really get caught up. But yeah, The Secret Lives of Dinosaurs, Dr. Dean R. Lomax. Thank you so much. It's been so nice chatting. Where can people buy the book? This will come out in June. So if there's any like upcoming dates or things like that, I can obviously put it all in the show notes and stuff. But yeah, where
fantastic.
to follow you, of course, you know?
Yeah, so no, it's been wonderful chatting to you, Stephen, about The Secret Lives of Dinosaurs, you know, my passion for paleo, where it came from. But yeah, you can get the copy of Secret Lives of Dinosaurs. Pretty much it should be, if it's in the US, it should be Barnes and Noble, and Amazon as well, and directly from the publisher, Columbia University Press. But yeah, if you do enjoy the book, I hope you really do enjoy it. But please leave us a good 5-star review as well on Amazon, because they do really help. And so yeah, and also if you want to keep up to date with my kind of adventures in paleontology, and as I say, I'll be kind of here, there, and everywhere over the coming, I guess, the next couple of months and things. So yeah, you can follow me on social media. I'm pretty active on Instagram and Facebook. Awesome. So yeah, I really hope you've enjoyed this, listeners, and it's been a wonderful pleasure to chat to you, Stephen.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening. And Stephen Ray Morrison, all the things, patreon.com/See Jurassic Right. And of course, you know, life finds a way. Hold on to your butts, but you know, look for some bones and know that those things were really there, and dinosaurs are animals, and they lived. So yeah, thank you everybody.